growing up in Western Europe, ever since I was a wee lad, I can remember people talking about a growing refugee crisis. What followed from a decades-long Western interference in the Middle East, then getting a famous attack on 9/11 that cost many lives and created the War on Terror. Ever since that, there have been war and climate refugees of the Middle East pouring into Europe, which has strained the already very shaky solidarity that the European Union represented. And as you might imagine, is having all these refugees pouring into a country and countries not being prepared and even willing to really integrate these people into their societies, there gets to be a rift between the native population and the migrants. And with that, in political terms, almost every single country in Europe has seen the rise of right-wing populist parties, popping up with their Islamophobic rhetoric in the Netherlands, and in France, of course, Marine Le Pen, but you also have other nativist rhetoric that just talks about protecting the native population from these migrants. But not just these migrants. I know that in the Netherlands, because we've had such colonial history, the Netherlands was very important in the transatlantic slave trade, and therefore, with the East India Trading Company, as you might know, the colonial history has allowed for many significant minority populations of former colonies. Think about Suriname or Indonesia. But there are also labor migrants, and these minority populations might be more significant or less significant, like Eastern European labor migrants, but they might also be very much ingrained into the cultural psyche of the Netherlands, because after the Second World War, building the Netherlands itself, it required lots of guest workers to build up the country again, but they never really got accepted. As you can see, or as you might experience in your own country, somehow when you talk about the native population, whether they be white or not, and minority populations, there are different degrees of respect or fear against different kinds of minorities. And those fears come and go with time. After 9/11 and the terrorist attacks that marked the first half of the 21st century, you get these rhetoric of Islamophobia that is most prevalent. But of course, there are also different kinds of rhetoric of economic exploitation, but these different minorities are just ranked differently. You can even make a very compelling case that in the United States, for example, their history have been mostly white people, and including different kinds of people within that category of white, where first like Italian and Irish people were considered off-white, and Slavic people were off-white and weren't really part of the original real whites. But the more you got slaves imported into America and becoming more and more important in the way the American economy functioned, the division became more about white and everything that is not black. And so you get very weird cases. You get cases that determine that the newly Mexican inherited population after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that this diaspora would all of a sudden be considered legally white or white enough and to not be black. But nowadays, even after the history of America being mostly white and black, and everything that is just not black, you also have that gender minorities become much more a different group that is feared all the same. There's lots of gender panic going around, of trans people participating in sports, and people trying to indoctrinate your children to all of a sudden be woke. So a minority doesn't necessarily need to be an ethnic minority. A minority needs to be something that the native population, the majority population, fears and therefore sees as an other. With all those different kinds of fears, with all those different tiers of minorities, there are so many fears and anger and misunderstandings that can be exploited and historically always have been exploited by the far right to get normal people to sign on to do very hideous things to these people. Not only do crises happen, there's compelling evidence to say that crises and a crisis feeling is mostly induced for political reasons. And you can see that now all the time, that woke outrage or outrage over wokeness, alleged wokeness, people, feminism going too far, people being up in arms about M&Ms all of a sudden losing their high heels, thinking it's a greater cultural significance. So you get culture wars about complete nonsense. You get culture wars about trans people in sports that might have a point, but you can have it in states like North Dakota that almost have no trans people at all, so the fear is mostly induced. Or you can have outrage about the M&Ms losing their high heels, or like the gas stoves is apparently a cultural marker in Florida with the governor Ron DeSantis, where 92% of people in Florida don't even have a gas stove. Now we get to what the video is actually about. Naturally, every country needs to find its own way to integrate different kinds of people within their society truly, but more often than not, we fail at doing that properly. And that process can be very tricky because no one can seem to agree what proper integration actually looks like. Far right, on the one hand, thinks that the white population is in danger. So you can have things like the Great Replacement theory, and they want a white ethno-state as a result, or they want at least to disenfranchise minority populations as much as possible, because having them have a vote threatens in democracy their power over culture, over the values, and the things that they really find important, their entire existence. To do so, you have to depict migrants and laborers as leeches, that they're not really contributing to society. And the way we linguistically even do this in the Netherlands is we have the terms allochtoon and autochtoon, which refers to a kind of rock that is stranded on a beach, but a rock that will always still bear the markings of the place that they came from. In that way, we invoke the idea that people that come into the Netherlands, when they are allochtoon, they will never be able to wash away the stain of the culture that they came from and never truly belong at the place that they arrive. Well, if migrants are just visitors, they are guests and leeches, they at best can just try to be a good house guest. They can try to assimilate to the rules of the house. They can get rid of their culture at the door and assimilate to the culture that they decided to live in. But on the other hand, they will never truly belong. We will never ever look at them like they are our fellow citizens, unless you make a political statement. If you think about it like paint, if you really want to preserve the immaculate whiteness of your white paint, you have to make sure that you do not add any other colors, because they will dilute the whiteness per definition. If that is your fear, to dilute the purity of the white paint bucket, you will make sure to leave all other colors out of your studio. They will not get any rights, they won't get anywhere close to the paint bucket, and therefore they are not important. And there are many common ways that you can try to keep the paint white at all costs. You can disenfranchise people's voting rights, making it more difficult to vote, making them be gerrymandered, for example, which disempowers their voices compared to the voices of people in the dominant population, at least if you have the people in the dominant population drawing the lines of voting. So there are very tricky electoral things that you can do in a democracy. But you can also just have overt discrimination, like in police brutality. Of course, with affirmative action, you have both sides, is that some populations are going to have to get an extra help in order to get to a point as equal, but you can just get rid of that and just never acknowledge the systemic inequalities that exist within a system. Or you can just close the borders. That's the thing that in Europe we talk about a lot, is that we just close the borders, because if we envision these migrants to be a stream of invaders, we have to close the borders. And if, like me, all those options of trying to keep the white paint white are a bit harsh and might be unnecessary, assimilation might not be for you. And the other option in the discussion, as it is framed throughout at least my upbringing, is that you either have assimilation or you can have integration. But the integration usually is called multiculturalism. In simple terms, multiculturalism is the idea that every different ethnicity and faith and minority can just live within the same borders of a country. They don't have to discriminate against one another. They have equal voting rights, they can be respected, and they don't have to assimilate or change themselves in order to appeal to the dominant culture. So everyone can just live alongside one another and sing Kumbaya. That's basically the idea. And that manifests in things like saying that you have to celebrate diversity, that you can just accept each other's differences, and all that. It seems like an obvious solution that even a toddler can imagine. Just be a decent person, treat everyone else with respect, live and let live. There's no need to whine about things like cultural homogeneity and oh no, my culture is getting erased, or that we need to adapt. Just give everyone the equal rights and be able to play in the same playing field. Well, yes, that sounds easy, but it really isn't what has manifested in Europe, and therefore I'm saying that multiculturalism has failed too. It has created its own antagonisms that we have to analyze to think of something better. And first we need to start about looking how the world is right now. The world is becoming increasingly globalized, which means that there are concentrated types of capital, multinational corporations that just move between countries easily. And as such, as multinational corporations and supranational organizations have become more powerful relative to the nation state, you get that it becomes more difficult to tax these corporations in any given country because they can just shop for the highest bidder or the lowest bidder in tax havens. Gradually, capitalism in the economic sphere is starting to eat away at the economic and political pie of governments, which means being unable to tax the corporations that operate within their countries, governments cannot get as much revenue in order to facilitate things like public services. So although their citizens might be working for a company, like that we always say, oh, they are job providers. Like it's good that Amazon comes here because they will provide jobs to the people here. But on the flip side, if the jurisdiction that Amazon gets in cannot be taxed by the local government that the workers need in order to survive if things go badly, all of these social services and potentiality of the government just get eroded away. And the more capitalism does capitalism stuff, the more inequality will rise, and with that inequality, there will be more need for a government to provide the social services like unemployment, but there will be less ability to do so. And if you can't provide basic services to have a life, then more people will suffer. So with the real leeches of big corporations and transnational capital, governments aren't able to actually provide the basic services that people need to survive and have a dignified life, and they lose the ability to influence economic matters in their country at all. And somehow, with privatization and the hustle, etc., we see this as a good thing. Even democratically, we can't address the problems that we have in a country if we do not have the funds to do so, because the government ultimately functions on the tax revenue that we all contribute to. And as democracy becomes less influential in material effects in people's lives, the more people actually start to wonder whether democracy makes sense at all. So lots of people will try to devolve into fascism and these tendencies of the alt-right, but there will also be people that are just disenfranchised and don't want to vote at all because it doesn't make a difference in their lives anyway. So I ask, what are we left with if all the economic policies are off the table of governments? What do we have a democracy for? Well, the only things that are left are social issues and cultural issues. And that's where the problem with multiculturalism starts. Because as we have seen, that is a recipe for disaster. In democratic terms, people will just always pick a team. People will get invested over nothing. People get worked up about M&M's losing their high heels. There will be people that get worked up about the gas stoves, as we talked about trans people in sports that you never even met. Think about what the schools are teaching your children is that they might have to be able to express their opinions, express themselves. All of a sudden, the most minute details become very important. And these kinds of fabricated conflicts are fresh breeding grounds for the alt-right. And most importantly, I argue that when you only talk about cultural issues, democracy has lost its substantive value, because a democracy should be about fixing things and improving material conditions for people. It should be about improving our lives together in a society and moving forward. But you can't do that if you only talk about social and cultural issues, as we have noticed being in this permanent state of nothing happening of the last 20 years, because these cultural issues cannot be won. There is no end of discussion. There is no right or wrong. It is a matter of values. We can only fight, we cannot win, we cannot understand, and we cannot move forward. Cultural issues, especially when you talk about minority populations, it just becomes a question of whether you are accepted or not. It is an eternal struggle that cannot ever be won, and therefore it is a way for one culture to maintain dominance over the other and to mandate their values as the one that the other ones should just submit to. And in this pointless struggle to be represented, everyone wants to be represented because it might be a threat to you if you are not represented at all. So the dominant culture wants to put their values upon the rest of society and everyone that lives there. But then you get that all these minority population all of a sudden are forced to embrace their most arbitrary characteristics, like the fact that they are their ethnicity, of their religious orientation. They become more factionalized within their own religious affiliation in opposition to the dominant group, which further perpetuates the struggle. But it's not even just religious and ethnic lines. Think about random things that become political all of a sudden. Even though everything is political, I understand, but when people say, why do you make this political? I can ask you, can you imagine a person in your mind that is a yoga teacher? Can you imagine what her politics might be? For some reason, we can now imagine, probably stereotypically, that someone that does yoga also is somewhat left-wing. It is someone that normally believes that the environment should be saved. So lifestyle things all of a sudden become so political that you can imagine someone's politics based on their artificial labels, things that don't really matter. But never forget things like geographical lines of the opposition between provinces or states, or between sexual orientations, that all of a sudden the existence of different types of queer people is a threat to the hetero-normal group, even though, especially when you talk about something like sex, you don't have to jump into bed with these people. There are so many fish in the sea, and you're most likely ain't getting none of them. In this eternal battlefield where very many fractions, very many alliances are formed based on issues that mean ultimately nothing. It is a struggle between people because they always fear that when the other group gets into power, they will do the same thing that we might do, probably won't actually do, and mandate our way of life out of existence. And in that world, no one would actually care to vote for any policy. No one cares about substantively asking, well, how are these people going to change my life? Not only because they usually cannot, and they will not, but which person has the right vibes? Who might I want to grab a beer with? All of this, even in the ideal scenario, is assuming that you can have neatly separated cultures living alongside one another. Cultures consist of people doing practices, customs, and traditions in order to uphold a sense of community and celebrate that. But think of cultures like bacteria cultures. If you put them all into one petri dish and you neatly separate them initially, they are bound to get into contact with one another and intermingle. You cannot stop people from seeking each other out because there are going to be places that people interact with one another, fall in love with one another, intermingle, and I think that is one of the most beautiful things that can possibly happen. But when you think of these strict traditionalists, strict conservatives, for example, it's not just whites that want to preserve the purity of the white race. There are also blacks in America, as I know, that frown upon interracial marriages or interreligious marriages, having their children marry people that are not black, that they would not be good enough for their children. Or you have that Jewish people often are very strict about making sure that the children are taught Jewish. And with none of these people is anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with being white, Jewish, and black. But trying to preserve the purity of your people is impossible because you cannot stand in the way of love. people will discard the culture entirely if they find someone that is worth fighting for. A culture in and of itself cannot be kept pure. It's much more like a language where you either use it and adapt it to modern times, or it will go extinct if no one practices it anymore. For a language to be alive, you need it to adapt in order to survive. If it stops being useful for the people in the day and therefore they would practice it in their daily interactions, it will eventually go extinct because people won't adopt it anymore. You can force people to learn your ancient tongue all you want, but as long as people are gradually less willing to learn it because of it being not useful, the language will die out. If not only the people that you force to learn the language, and they will inevitably slowly start not picking up the language anymore if it's not useful, it's also difficult to attract new people into it if you are so strict about the purity of your people. Slowly, your culture will die out, just like the language. And I think that languages dying out, just like cultures dying out, is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very good thing, for example. If a language becomes so archaic and never used that it just becomes tedious, think about Latin, for example, that people never use in real life, or even something lofty and great as Esperanto that might be the most efficient world language, but just people don't pick it up, it doesn't necessarily deserve to survive. In the same way with cultures, we fetishize the idea of maintaining our culture because it's our sense of community, our sense of purpose, especially in our political times when our differences and our cultural issues are more important. Apparently, we really think it's important to maintain our cultural identity. But not all cultures deserve to survive. If you have a culture that becomes too cannibalistic, in that it's just too puritanical at keeping out people of other faiths, people of other kinds, prohibiting basic things in life that allow people to thrive, are not only bad for the people that follow the culture, but also bad for everyone around it, then I don't think that the culture should necessarily survive. Then it becomes more like a cult. And we know what happens if you have a cult that runs wild and no one does something about it. But also, to stay alive for a culture, it needs to adapt. And that means that one or more practices start to have to get with the times. Think about that a culture doesn't mean that all of its practices are equally maintained and preserved. It needs to get with the times. Just as much as we do not sacrifice people to the gods anymore, to get rain, for example. We do not do stoning as much, hopefully. We do not burn gay people anymore, or we burn witches at the stake. We do not do public executions anymore with the guillotine as much, or start whipping our children into shape in schools. Correct that. People are starting to whip children again in schools because apparently spanking is okay now again. But we also do not flagellate, so whip ourselves to absolve ourselves of sin. Christianity can exist without that practice. You can have cultures that adapt to the times, and they absolutely need to, because these cruel practices need to go. Culture shouldn't be maintained just for the sake of it. Over time, cultures have to change. And they have, as a testament of evolution, that these cultures still survive to this day. Christianity, for example, has had to change a lot. It has had to change in order to keep up with the people that practice it and enrich their lives more than it hurts them. So over time, any culture has the moments of which practices do we keep and which is nonsense that we have to discard. Not only can you not stop the inevitable change of cultures, you also should not stop it because it's a blessing. A change of culture allows for growth. It allows for many more perspectives to be seen on any given matter, and thus enrich it for everyone that practices the culture. If your culture being a thing that you need to preserve and you want to battle for it for sole supremacy, that defeats the entire purpose of multiculturalism, that you can just coexist besides one another. Ironically, and it's gonna sound weird and it doesn't happen often, the racists kind of have a point here. Culture really is a stand-in for race too, and that it is all about genetics. Preserving the gene pool, as they say. But hold your horses there. It does not mean that the racists actually know what they're talking about, because ironically, even though they profess to know all about biology class and about genetics, they might have missed the part of the biology lesson where it says that the gene pool is stronger when there is much genetic variety present. It allows the gene pool to have offspring of many different types of genes that are better prepared to survive as a species and deal with the obstacles that the world presents. And that you call genetic fitness. And you get to the conclusion that the idea of a purity of culture, like the idea of a purity of a race, is just a lie. It's a lie because if you really want to preserve the purity of your gene, then you will have to turn to incest. And although they sometimes do that, what usually happens if you turn to incest is that the offspring is less genetic variety and as a result usually has massive malformations and mutations that create, unfortunately, lots of genetic diseases that they didn't ask for. So, genetically speaking, the fairy tale of purity is destructive for itself. You absolutely need cross-pollination to have genetic variety to even stand a chance to not have all these physical and mental deformities. I think a character in a video game that I used to play said it best, that change is good. And in my opinion, change is one of the most beautiful things in the world. It allows for so many beautiful new perspectives. If you think about the results from interracial or interreligious marriages, or those offspring, the babies, are usually absolutely gorgeous. But also think about people of different backgrounds of all different types coming together. It leads to the most interesting conversations, hashing out differences, finding out what you both really believe, and a better understanding about yourself. And scientifically, we also know that an increased interaction with people of different backgrounds, of course, results in less racism, which is called the contact hypothesis. And that way, culture is always best experienced intermingled. It's kind of like a culture being different spices that flavor a meal. And ironically, whites usually don't use many spices. And as any good cook would tell you, a marriage of spices is needed to enrich, enhance, and actually bring out the flavors that make the meal so much better. If you add no spices at all, the meal will just be stale. And if you add too much spice, well, your taste buds will reject it. So you need to find a middle ground there. If one flavor tries to dominate the entire meal, it ruins your taste buds. Change here is inevitable, and it happens like our grandmothers always told us that the secret ingredients to our meals is love. Change happens when we try to include all people and try to encourage their inputs too. It happens of those of different backgrounds that fall in love with one another and have the result of their union be either children or a happiness that inspires everyone around them with the beauty that it results, allowing them to also explore and find love themselves. Love here is the catalyst for change. It cannot be expended, and it has a mind of its very own. It seeks to be multiplied and passed on. All forms of love are created equal. Well, within legal bounds, of course. Don't get any wrong ideas. All loves are equal because love happens when people want to get on the same level, try to understand one another, and when two or more people, because it can be more people, it can also just be a communal relationship, between lovers and friends in a community get together in order to form a connection. I would hope that we would never forget that love is the one most important thing. Never let it die. It is the one universal thing about the human condition. For all that people talk about what is natural for people when things change all the time. What is it what we have in common with people that we think is the other, when people that we've never communicated with? For some reason, love is the only thing that we all share, the thing that we all desire. It is the one thing of the human condition that I think is worth fighting for, to preserve, and no one ever has to fight over it because it can never be expended. Any future worth fighting for is built upon a foundation of love. And it is up to you whether you would allow the whispers of division to cloud your mind and commit heinous crimes in order to purge the others. And that is where it is crucially important to get rid of the idea of multiculturalism as well. It is not enough to merely exist alongside one another. You have to intermingle. You have to find each other and truly integrate, because no culture is worth purging others over. Trying to stop the mingling and change is like carrying water against the tide. However cliche you think it might sound, love always wins in the end. In the long term, which we're not conditioned to think about, love is always stronger than any human nonsense that we create for ourselves to keep ourselves separate. And with that, I leave you. We can do way better. Find yourself someone that you might not agree with, someone that is from a different background, try to understand them, and who knows? You might even get some very beautiful offspring. Well, or just happiness, but offspring usually, like, have you seen them? If for some reason you're still here, thank you. It's good to see you, hopefully again. If you liked the video, like and subscribe. Mostly leave a comment, because I'm very curious to know whether you're also as done as I am by hearing about these culture wars, people fighting about nothing and just being angry. Otherwise, I will leave a video up for you that you might enjoy, but if you've seen other videos, let me know whether it's worth continuing.